All right, welcome back everyone. In our last explainer, we really set the stage, didn't we? We looked at that rigid structure of 18th century French society and saw how this new, growing middle class was starting to dream of a world without all those special privileges. Well, today, we're going to jump right into the chain of events that actually lit the fuse on one of history's biggest explosions.
So how on earth does a simple problem about taxes end up toppling a monarchy that's been around for 1,000 years? Well, it started because the French king was broke. But his attempt to fix a financial crisis accidentally unleashed a political storm so massive it brought the entire old regime, the whole traditional way of life in France, crashing down. Let's see exactly how that happened.
You see, King Louis XVI found himself in a really tight spot. He desperately needed to raise taxes. But back in old regime France, a king couldn't just snap his fingers and make that happen. Nope. He had to call a meeting of the Estates General, which is kind of like a parliament with people from all three social classes, to get their stamp of approval on any new taxes.
Now, here's what makes this so wild. No king had bothered to call the Estates General for 175 years. The last time they met was way back in 1614. So for the king to call this meeting on May 5th, 1789, that was a huge deal. It was basically a public announcement that the monarchy was in serious trouble.
Okay, so picture this, a magnificent, resplendent hall in the Palace of Versailles. The setup itself just screamed inequality. You had the 300 representatives from the clergy and the 300 from the nobility all sitting comfortably in rows, facing each other. But the 600 members of the Third Estate, the commoners, they were forced to stand at the back. The social hierarchy was literally built right into the room's layout.
But the real powder keg, the thing that was going to blow this all up, came down to voting. The old way of doing things was simple. Each estate got one single vote. This always meant the clergy and the nobility could team up and outvote the commoners 2-1 every time. But the Third Estate, fired up by these new democratic ideas from philosophers like Rousseau, came in with a totally radical demand: one person, one vote. In a society built on groups, the idea of individual power was revolutionary, and if it passed, they'd have the majority.
So what happens when the king just flat out rejects their idea? Well, the members of the Third Estate finally realized the whole system was rigged. They'd had enough. So in this incredible act of defiance, they just walked out of the assembly. They were completely done playing by the old rules.
On June 20th, they all gathered together in a nearby indoor tennis court, of all places. And it was right here, in this totally unconventional spot, that they declared themselves the true voice of the French nation, the National Assembly. This moment was an absolute turning point in the revolution. And there, on that tennis court, they made an incredibly powerful promise, which we now call the Tennis Court Oath. They swore that they would not stop, would not go home, until they had written a brand new constitution for France, one that would finally put limits on the king's absolute power. This wasn't about giving advice anymore. This was about building a whole new government.
So who was leading this charge? Well, get this, in a fascinating twist, the most powerful voices for the commoners weren't actually commoners. Their leaders were people like Mirabeau, a nobleman who turned his back on his own privileged class, and Abbe Sieyès, a priest who wrote this super influential pamphlet that asked, "What is the Third Estate?" His famous answer? Everything.
But here's the thing, all of this political drama at Versailles wasn't happening in a bubble. While these delegates were busy debating, the rest of France was basically erupting. The political crisis was on a collision course with a crisis of pure survival out on the streets.
You see, a really severe winter had led to a terrible harvest, which meant the price of bread, the absolute staple food for the poor, went through the roof. People were literally starving, and they started accusing bakers of hoarding grain to make prices even higher. After standing in long lines for hours, crowds of angry women just started storming the bakeries. This was about survival.
At the exact same time, the king is getting nervous, so he orders troops to move into Paris. The people saw this and immediately thought it was a threat. So in response, on July 14th, a huge, agitated crowd stormed the Bastille, this old medieval fortress that was used as a prison and had become a symbol of the king's tyranny. And they tore it down, brick by brick.
And this chaos wasn't just a Paris thing. Oh no! A wave of panic, which became known as the Great Fear, swept across the entire countryside. Rumors were just spreading like wildfire that the lords had hired bandits to go around and destroy all the peasants' ripe crops.
So caught in this frenzy of fear and pure rage, peasants started taking matters into their own hands. They grabbed whatever they could, hoes, pitchforks, and attacked the chateaus, the castles of the nobility. They looted grain that had been hoarded, and maybe most importantly, they burned the documents that listed all the feudal taxes and duties they owed to the lords. They were literally burning the records of their own servitude. So many nobles just fled the country in terror.
So now, Louis XVI is stuck between a rock and a hard place. He's got a political rebellion in Versailles on one side and a violent social revolution across the entire country on the other. He really had no choice. He had to recognize the authority of the National Assembly and finally accept that his power would be limited by a constitution.
I mean, just stop and think about how fast all of this happened. On May 5th, this ancient political body gets together for the first time in ages. By August 4th, just 3 months later, the entire feudal foundation of France has been completely swept away. It was a single summer that changed absolutely everything.
So on this one incredible night, August 4th, 1789, the National Assembly passed a decree that changed history. In a single marathon session, they just dismantled centuries of tradition. Poof, the entire feudal system of taxes and obligations was abolished. The clergy were forced to give up their special privileges. That church tax, the tithe, was eliminated. And all lands owned by the church were confiscated by the state.
And we are not talking about a small amount of money here. The church lands that were confiscated were worth at least 2 billion livres. This was a massive, massive transfer of wealth and power that completely reshaped French society practically overnight.
Whoa, okay. That was a whirlwind, right? Let's just hit pause on the story for a second and quickly go over the key dates, figures, and terms that you absolutely need to remember for your exams.
First up, the key dates. You've got to have these 4 locked down. May 5th, 1789. That's when the Estates General meets and kicks this whole thing off. June 20th, the super important tennis court oath. July 14th, the symbolic storming of the Bastille. And finally, August 4th, the night the old feudal system was totally abolished.
Next up, the key people. Of course, you've got Louis XVI, the king right in the middle of the storm. You have the philosopher Rousseau, whose big ideas about democracy really fired everyone up. And then you have those 2 unlikely leaders of the commoners' cause, the noble Mirabeau and the priest Abbé Sieyès.
And finally, just a couple of key vocabulary words you'll want to know. A chateau is basically a fancy castle or a grand home that belongs to a king or a nobleman. And a manor is the whole shebang, the entire estate of a lord, which includes all his lands and his mansion.
So there you have it. The revolution had managed to tear down the entire old structure of France. The main pillars of the old regime, feudalism, privilege, absolute monarchy, they were all gone. But that left a huge question, right? What do you build to replace it? Join us in the next Explainer, where we'll find out how France became a constitutional monarchy. See you then.